So let's explore what the source material actually uncovers about this pretty surprising claim
Yeah.
that Adam and Eve might have been the original pioneers of plant-based eating.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this. The material jumps right in, making this bold statement. In the biblical creation account, Adam and Eve were likely vegetarian, maybe even vegan.
Yes, and the textual evidence it really hangs this on is key. It points straight to Genesis 1, verse 29. This is right after humanity's creation, where God says, and the source quotes it, "I give you every seed-bearing plant and every tree with seed-bearing fruit. They will be yours for food." And the
Mhm.
source really emphasizes that in this initial description, the Garden of Eden, this is the only food source mentioned for humans, period.
And it's not limited to humans either, is it? The source points out Genesis 1.30, like right after, which talks about God giving every green plant as food for all the animals, the beasts, the birds, everything crawling on the ground.
hmm And what's powerful about the source's reading here uh, is how it presents this as the original blueprint, the design. It's not just like a suggestion. It's part of the description of that initial very good creation. It paints a picture of a world where all living things, human and animal alike, were subsisting purely on plants. No predation, no meat eating.
Okay, and the source also brings in some, well, interesting historical context about when Genesis might have been written down,
Hmm?
suggesting maybe during the Babylonian exile, around the 6th century BCE. Why is that timing significant according to the material?
Well, it's significant because, as the source notes, this era is roughly contemporary with figures like Pythagoras, maybe the beginnings of Buddhism. Both traditions that, while very different, have associations with vegetarian or at least plant-focused diets, often for philosophical or spiritual reasons. So the source seems to be hinting that this kind of plant-based thinking wasn't completely, out of the blue in the broader intellectual world, potentially around the time this text was compiled.
Huh, that's fascinating. It really raises this big question, which the source wants us to think about. Is this description in Genesis 1 meant to be like a historical record of what actually happened? Or is it sketching out an ideal world, maybe driven by a religious or ideological vision of how things should be?
Exactly. Is it reporting or is it like theology or
Or,
philosophy? The source doesn't exactly land on one answer, but it forces you to hold those possibilities together when you read that text.
okay, right. So let's dig into the specifics then. This vegan menu from Genesis chapter 1, as the source lays it out, what exactly are Adam and Eve supposed to be eating?
Well, based purely on that verse, Genesis 1.29, the source details two main categories: seed-bearing plants and fruit from trees. So, seed-bearing plants that would cover things like loans, legumes, beans, lentils, peas. Also many vegetables whose plants bear seeds, like nightshades or cucumbers. The source even suggests flavorings like mustard, garlic, onions fit here, things that grow from seed-bearing plants.
Okay. And the fruit trees. That seems more
That's,
straightforward.
yeah, things we normally think of as fruits, apples, berries, citrus, dates. But botanically speaking, it also includes nuts like cashews, walnuts, and seeds like almonds, sunflower seeds, all coming from trees that produce fruit-containing seeds. The source lists a pretty vibrant range, strawberries, pineapples, olives. It's quite broad.
So actually a diet that sounds incredibly rich. Complex carbs, protein from legumes and nuts, healthy fats, vitamins, minerals. Sounds pretty complete, doesn't it? And the source mentions Genesis 1.1, indicating God basically made all this food readily available.
Exactly. The initial picture is one of like effortless abundance. Everything needed is just there. But the source is careful to note this changes. After the events described in Genesis chapter 3, the tree of knowledge, Genesis 3 verses 17-18 are cited. This is where the ground gets cursed. And humans now have to toil, work really hard, sweat, just to produce food from that same ground.
Okay, so the effort involved changes dramatically.
Yeah.
But does the diet itself change at that point, according to the source's reading?
That's a key point the source makes. It argues that apart from the new hardship of labor, the components of the diet, the things they eat, they remain plant-based in this part of the narrative. They're still eating the plants, the ground yields, just, through sweat and difficulty now.
Right. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because the source talks about how someone actually tried to turn this specific idea into a modern diet plan. Gordon Tesler in his Genesis diet.
Yes, Tesler. As a writer on nutrition, he apparently looked at Genesis 1 and had this thought like, okay, if God designed the perfect world and the perfect initial diet, well, that's the one we should follow. And this led him to write a best-selling book proposing a diet supposedly rooted in these Genesis 1 principles.
But the source seems pretty critical, or at least analytical, of Tesler's actual plan. It points out that while he includes a lot of plant-based foods, good stuff,
Hmm.
and eliminates things like processed sugar, white flour, saturated fats rules common in many modern diets, his plan isn't strictly based on Genesis 1 alone.
No, exactly. The source makes that point quite clearly. It argues Tesler seems to be kind of cherry picking from different parts of the entire Bible. He's pulling rules and ideas from various different eras and contexts within the biblical texts rather than sticking purely to that initial creation account diet.
Ah, okay. And that's the crucial distinction the source is drawing, because the biblical narrative itself changes the dietary rules,
Yeah.
dramatically even, later on.
Absolutely. The source really highlights the huge shift in Genesis chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. This is after the flood narrative. God is speaking to Noah and his family, sort of resetting things. And right there, God explicitly gives humans permission to eat meat. The verse says something like, "Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything."
Whoa. Okay, hold on. That's a massive shift from Genesis 1, where it was specific plants for humans, green plants for animals. Now humans get everything, including animals.
Precisely. That's how the source interprets it. A clear change in divine instruction, maybe presented in the narrative as necessary for survival in a changed post-flood world, or maybe reflecting a fundamentally altered relationship between humans and creation. There is that restriction mention about not eating meat with its lifeblood still in it, but the basic permission to eat animal flesh, it's granted right there in Genesis 9.
And the source shows this evolution of rules doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah.
Later books add even more layers.
Yes, exactly. The source points to Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. These books lay out extensive lists of dietary laws specifically for the Israelites, distinguishing between clean and unclean animals. So you get these detailed lists, animals you can eat, like cattle, sheep, goats, certain fish, and animals you can't eat, pigs, camels, shellfish, certain birds, and so on. This adds layers and layers of complexity, far beyond the simple plant diet of Genesis 1 or even the general permission for meat in Genesis 9.
And the source even catches little details, like how Tesler's diet apparently says only babies should drink milk, and traces that idea maybe to a verse in 1 Corinthians, but then contrasts it with the famous description of the Promised Land in Numbers as flowing with milk and honey, which clearly wasn't just for babies.
Right. It effectively demonstrates, as the source argues, how Tesler's specific Genesis diet isn't really a pure Genesis 1 diet. It's more of a blend, taking bits and pieces from various biblical passages and perhaps modern nutritional ideas too, which highlights the source's point about selective interpretation or cherry picking.
So what the source really maps out for us is that this idea of a purely plant-based diet in the Bible, it's strongly tied to that initial creation account in Genesis 1. But the rules, the permissions, they evolve quite significantly as you move through the rest of the narrative.
It really underscores that original question the source raised. Was Genesis 1 describing an ideal, maybe lost world or a historical reality? Especially when you see how quickly the narrative itself changes the script on diet after the flood.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the source traces that specific thread diet through different parts of the text. It reveals this really dynamic picture.
It definitely makes you appreciate the different phases, the different instructions you find within the larger biblical story.
Well, this deep dive into the source material has certainly given us a lot to chew on, so to speak.
Yeah, we've seen how the source anchors that claim Adam and Eve initially plant-based right in Genesis 1, verses 29 and 30. Describing that diet of only plants and fruits for humans and just green plants for animals in that specific creation narrative.
Right. And we explored how the source makes it really clear that this isn't the only dietary picture in the Bible. It detailed that big shift in Genesis 9.3 to 4, where permission to eat meat is explicitly given after the flood, and how that's followed by even more complex dietary laws later on in books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
And the source also gave us that interesting case study of Gordon Tesler's Genesis diet, highlighting how, as the source presents it, that diet seems to combine elements from these different biblical periods rather than sticking just to Genesis 1, that cherry-picking idea again.
And all of this really circles back to that compelling question the source keeps implicitly asking. Is that Genesis 1 account meant to be read as a description of a reality that once existed? Or is it presenting more of an ideal vision, a blueprint for humanity's place in the world?
Yeah, and thinking about all these different dietary guidelines the source shows us, appearing right there throughout the Bible, from the purely plant-based beginning, then shifting to universal permission for meat, then layering on detailed laws about clean and unclean. It really prompts a final question for you to consider based on the source. What does this whole progression suggest about how the biblical narrative itself understands humanity's changing relationship with food and maybe with the natural world over time?